today is the launch of our Mental Health at Work report. Our National Employee Survey is the most comprehensive workplace survey of its kind. Unbelievably, nearly 20,000 people took part in the survey, and the findings are powerful. They demonstrate positive progress, but also worrying disconnects. We started this journey to overcome stigma around mental health at work back in 2014, when we set out both the compelling business and moral case for addressing mental health issues. We then followed that up with Mental Health We're Ready to Talk 1 year on, which actually tracked the progress of our members. And then earlier this year, in terms of the theme of mental health, and in particular the role of line managers in embedding mental health into organisational culture, we launched Leading on Mental Wellbeing, Transforming the Role of Line Managers. And then our call for action was to introduce mental health first aid training. So this survey is a natural progression of the work that we've been doing for the last nearly 3 years. So we wanted to hear from UK PLC in terms of what employees were actually experiencing through the lens of a line manager. And we recognise that the role of line managers is really key. So our mental health report is a product of incredible collaboration. I'd like to thank BITC's Wellbeing Leadership Team for providing overall direction, and our research partner YouGov. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Anglian Water, National Grid and Procter & Gamble, for making it possible. The report has been an unprecedented collaboration with our network partners. We've been working with CIPD, Institute of Leadership and Management, Maudsley Learning at Work, Mental Health First Aid, Mind and the Work Foundation. And I think the fact that we've all worked together as a coalition and come up with some really powerful recommendations in terms of actually digesting the raw data from the YouGov is absolutely tremendous. I'd also like to thank our supporters, many of whom are here today, including Action on Happiness, Institute of Occupation and Safety and Health, PHE and Prospect Union. And finally, I'd like to thank Forster Communications for producing the report, along with BITC colleagues, and in particular, Stephanie Schreiber, the project manager, and Rebecca Gregory, our head of comms, for helping to secure such high quality and extensive media coverage. So thank you. So I would now like to hand over to Gavin to present the findings.
Thank you, Louise. It's a great pleasure to be here today and to take you through some of the summary findings from the survey and to explain to you in more detail some of those key takeouts which we have summarised both in the report and in these slides. Start with what we actually did in the survey. So we did a survey, which is a representative survey of 3,000 full and part-time employees across all industries, size and UK regions. So as Louise mentioned, this is a UK PLC and the definition of the full and part-time workers across all those sectors and business sizes. It was supported by an open access survey, which gathered around 16,000 responses and was promoted through a number of different channels, including social media and through the network partners and so on. So that's a survey which we do refer to in the report and in these slides occasionally, but the main focus of the survey is the representative 3,000 response survey that YouGov provided, because we have the assurance that what we're looking at there is representative of the workforce. Our focus in coming up with a questionnaire was to explore those issues of mental health and well-being in the workplace, in particular the role of managers. So we asked questions around how many people the respondent managed, and we classified them as line managers and we were able to kind of look at their details separately from those who had no responsibility. And there were many questions that were only asked of managers because of their because of being so important in the process. We looked at the experiences that people had had of mental health problems in the workplace, but also the experiences of managing people who had had issues with mental health in the workplace. We looked at sort of general culture and confidence in handling issues, and we also took a look at training and the kinds of things that people think, both and those with no responsibilities for management, the kinds of things that they think would be useful for them to have in their personal toolkit. We start with the kind of quite stark findings that just bring it home to us that it's something that touches upon a huge number of people. In a kind of lifetime incidence, we found that 77% of people had experienced some of the symptoms of poor mental health over their whole lifetime. And that 2% of those would connect the experiences that they had had, particularly with things that were going on in the workplace as well. So it's really not a minority issue at all. It's affecting so many people. We asked about recently, the last issue that they had experienced was, we found that nearly a quarter of employees had experienced something in the last month. And despite seeing how prevalent that is in the workplace, it struck me when I looked at some of the results for line managers that just 6% of line managers reported that someone that they managed had approached them to discuss a mental health issue. So when you see those high numbers there and then you realize that people are not coming forward and talking to their managers about it, you can see that some of the issues that still have to be overcome. So for those that had had an experience, what happened to them? Who did they go to for any support? We found that the most recent time it had happened, just over a third didn't receive any support at all. We found some quite stark differences between women and men in terms of their, I suppose, their degree of comfort or confidence in talking about some of these issues. So we do find that, say, women were more likely to go to family members to talk about things than men were. So people like myself don't like to talk about these things too much. You can see there's a big difference there between women in terms of friends, 28% to 16%. And there's low expectations, actually, that the workplace is a place where you would go to get support. So it talked about family members being somewhere that you would go and perhaps have a discussion about the issues that you're facing. And that still remains, a key port of call for those who think that in the future they could have some issues. We find that a lot of people would just turn to their GP or think that they would turn to their GP, followed by family members and friends. And then a website, a generic website, ranks up the same level as their line manager, for example. So we see that the options that are in the workplace tend to be scored quite lowly. Only around 1 in 10 would talk to, say, another colleague about the issues that they're facing. And fewer than the numbers would go to people in HR, for example, or any kind of mentor that they had. And throughout the surveys, we had a number of questions asking for people's real life experiences. And they wrote, some of them wrote a lot of information around that. This is a quote from one particular employee. This employee didn't have any management experience themselves, but they highlighted the issue around the culture of their organisation and used the important word called trust. So perhaps the reason that they would not go in the future if they had an issue is related to that belief and the feeling that there would be no trust. So when they did present with the mental health problems, the symptoms that they were experiencing, In over half of the cases, when they looked back on it, they said that nothing had actually happened in terms of actions in the workplace. We're not assuming that something has to happen as a result of experiencing some of the symptoms there. But for so many of them to say that nothing was adjusted or changed, or there was no kind of impacts or reaction from the workplace, is something to think about. 30% of people had what we would consider to be a kind of positive or neutral action as a result of talking it through at the workplace. And the majority, or the action that was most often recorded, was that people were given some periods of time off work. And that was the case for 14% of people thinking about the last time that this had happened. On the more negative side of things, some of the things that had happened to people included being sacked or forced out of their position. Others said that they had gone through disciplinary procedures. And when we sort of totaled that up, it got to almost 1 in 10 of those people thinking about the experiences they had said that they'd either had disciplinary procedures or been forced out of their organisation. It's a figure that is obviously much too high. We asked them, okay, you didn't get much support, or there wasn't, much action as a result, but what would have been helpful? And we put a list in front of them. The main thing that tended to come up, was just simply greater support with their workload or the redesigning of their job. Others said time spent working from home or periods of time off, greater kind of flexi time. On the top of people's wish list, we think about how to handle the situation that they faced at that time. Looking at it from the manager's perspective, again, thinking of kind of what happened, what experiences did they have when they thought back to the most recent time that they managed someone who had some symptoms of mental health problems. Around about a quarter of them said that they had no support from. So around a third said that they'd had some kind of support with their own. Around a fifth said that they had some kind of contact with people in HR. But yeah, as I say, around a quarter else in their workplace around it. There's kind of a theme that came out in the report, which was around a gap between the lip service, if you like, around some of these issues sometimes, and the actual delivery of it in the front line. So when we asked how well each person felt that their workplace dealt with handled mental health problems, we found that a huge proportion of people at the kind of board level, so 60%, think that their organisation supports those with mental health problems very or fairly well. Those people at that board level have that perception that these issues are handled well. Not to be all doom and gloom, there are some positive aspects. And one of the things that I picked out as being one of the most positive aspects is that line managers do accept that well-being and mental health in the workplace is part of their responsibility. So just in the same way as they have other responsibilities, hitting targets and so on, they do tend to acknowledge that it is their responsibility to think about. And the majority of them, 80%, agree that what they do themselves and the way that they behave affects the well-being of their team members as well. There's a number of quite interesting questions about managerial culture in the workplace, where there's a lot more detail on that. But having said that, there's a fairly large proportion of them tend to think that their organisation doesn't provide enough support for managers who are facing some of these issues, and that often they do come under that kind of pressure, whether it's around targets or performance, where they can actually admit that they will often put corporate interests above the well-being of their team. One of the things I noticed was quite interesting as well, is that you tended to get quite a large difference between female managers and male managers, and it won't surprise you to hear that men are not coming off very well from this again. Female managers do tend to have that acknowledgement and that recognition that what they can do affects other people. They tend to have a greater level of confidence and comfort in handling the issues. Only 1 in 5 managers actually think that there are no barriers to supporting mental health in their organisation, which is perhaps a concerning figure. The things that kind of come up highest are the fact that they don't feel they've had any training themselves in the issue, and that also that they don't have that much time in their day for the one-to-one kind of contact, which is part of the managerial culture in their organisation. There's some perhaps encouragement that some of the things down the bottom there don't tend to feature too much. Again, acknowledgement that it's not their responsibility, nothing to do with me. There's not many of them that say that that's actually a barrier to them offering support. And they don't tend to pick out that you must treat everyone the same, so they can't offer support for that reason as well. So it's possible that by targeting a few of those things towards the top of the bar chart there, that some progress could be made. Because out of all of the out of a number of diversity, equalities issues, mental health problems, and we said, such as anxiety or depression, we weren't sort of picking very harder mental health problems. Our mental health problems do come down right at the bottom of the list in terms of people's feeling that they can talk about these issues in the workplace. So you're far more likely to talk about age-related differences between people in the workplace. You're actually more likely to talk about issues of sexual orientation or of religion or of race than you are to feel comfortable talking about mental health problems, which does suggest that it's almost like the last thing, in the terms of the various strands of diversity and equality. And that translates through to say just half of men and then just over half of women would actually feel confident talking to their manager, particularly. So there's a general sort of level of only maybe half people feel comfortable talking about that issue in the workplace, and then only half feel confident talking to their line manager about those issues. And on the other side, only around a third of managers are not confident that they would actually recognise the symptoms of mental health problems. And this doesn't really vary with age too much, although it does vary in terms of men and women, as I mentioned before. Those managers that have had some kind of personal experience of it, as you perhaps expect, they're far more likely to feel confident that they can recognise the symptoms themselves. And female managers tend to be more confident than men that they could actually do something that would be supportive. So 82% of female line managers felt that they would have the confidence to respond to someone who presented with signs of stress. And 68% of female managers said the same about depression as well. And you can find it's not too hard to find some positive comments from the stories that people have shared with us. And there was one of them there on the left-hand side about a female line manager following a real kind of process of talking on quite a regular basis with the person that needed a bit of support. This question was asked to everyone, to the extent to which, why was it that would they have a problem, or would they have any issues approaching someone who they felt might have mental health issues in the workplace? We did find that just 14% felt that nothing would stop them approaching someone to talk about it. The main things that did were kind of informal, kind of cultural barriers, perhaps. 40% of people said they just didn't want to interfere, they didn't want to be seen as interfering. But a third of them say, well, I don't know how to start the conversation, which is the kind of thing that you might pick up in some training or some coaching around the issues. And we did notice quite a big difference on the basis of age. So you tend to find that younger people would lack a bit of confidence around that as well. And that may just be because they've not had some of those experiences in the workplace, not sort of years of of talking to people. But it could be that they need a bit of extra help on the younger people's side to be able to have that confidence, to have those conversations. Specifically on the issue of training, we find that only 9% of line managers have had a specific mental health training course. If you included sort of mental health being, as a part of general training or management training, then it does get up to around 22% of line managers have had some element of mental health training as part of a course. The kind of things that they think that they might want to have, a lot of them said, online resources, information and guidance, but some basic training. So around about half of them thought that some just basic training in conditions would be helpful. Around 42% said just for the senior managers to feel more supportive about the issues. And it is positive that 81% of managers actually wanted something. So there is a kind of desire out there, a feeling that they need something that would actually help them. To summarise the kind of key themes, and these match the themes that are in the report that you've got in your packs. In the first section, say, well, we all have mental health, and we go back to the quite large figures. 6 out of 10 have experienced the symptoms related to work, and a quarter have done so in the last month. Another theme, this disconnection between an aspiration and a reality, which can be between very senior people in the workplace and more junior people. It can be about line managers wanting to try to do something, but not feeling like they've got the toolkit themselves to be able to help. There's also an issue around the pervasive culture of silence. So what is the culture like in the workplace? Would you actually feel comfortable talking to your manager about it? And what about the role of the line manager themselves? So they recognise that it's part of their responsibilities to do something, but they lack the confidence to recognise the symptoms or to use any kind of information that they may have, or to signpost or to apply any training that they've had, and so few of them have had training. And it has tend to be men and younger people who have the lowest levels of confidence in being able to help and support. And then the last theme in the report is, what has actually happened for people? Well, in many cases, nothing happened. There was no kind of action as a result of the experiences that they'd had. And the kind of positive or neutral kind of reactions, things that were put in place, only accounted for sort of less than a third of those who'd had the experiences. So there's a mixture there of the kind of quite worrying, concerning aspects, but also a real desire on the part of many to know more and to understand more and to gain more knowledge and experience, and to be able to apply that to the people they recognise they have a responsibility to help. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Opportunity to ask some questions, but would you, if you look in your packs, you'll find a question card. So if you could quickly scribble down your questions, we'll collect them, and then selection. Thank you. Okay, Gavin, I hope I can read this. So while we're waiting for the other questions, given that women are more likely to talk about mental health issues at work, do they have better outcomes than men?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, we would be able to, I'm not sure I can remember, actually, from off the top of my head, but we would be able to look at that, actually, because we have, as I say, kind of classified the outcomes that they'd had, or maybe Rebecca remembers. So in that case, their expectations were perhaps higher, and then perhaps not met. It's a good question.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? If you don't want to write them down, do you want to stick your hand up? Yes. Do you want to say who you are and where you're from?
I think a lot of people hope it will just pass, and that's why there's just inactivity. And I was wondering if there are any statistics that show what happens if you do nothing. Is the issue reoccurring? Is performance going down? And if we do something, what would, if the managers are trained, does the issue reoccur less, or does the performance go up, or are there any statistics like that?
Yes, there would be, again, in the data, yeah, because we've got, we know which managers said they had received some training, so we would be able to look at the differences between managers who had, we'd be able to look at, not that many, because not that many had full specific mental health training, but we'd probably have enough to look at some differences between them and the others. And on your first point, that is very true. And I do think that sometimes, as I say, the fact that nothing happened as a result of them disclosing into the workplace isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it can, these issues, it was very apparent from the case studies that have been written and submitted. They were talking about things that had gone on for long periods of time. And so both line managers and the people who are experiencing were telling us about things that had lasted months or years and that got worse or got better over time. And so I think we have to remember that. Quite hard in a survey to kind of summarise how long they've been living with some of those symptoms, because as they kind of come and go, and we did need to ask them about the most recent kind of experiences that they'd had. But yeah, we do recognise that it certainly goes up and down.
Marcus, I know you had your hand up.
I actually sent it on a note, but I can ask the question. I'm Marcus from YouGov. Thank you. My question is about the difference in responses from blue and white collar. Were you able to allocate certain responses that were more prevalent, white collar versus blue? So maybe the conversation with the line manager, or how their work was impacted by mental health disorders?
Yes. So we were. We did have that on the basis of their industry sector, for example. We could make some comparisons between that side. Again, I think that's probably in the detail of the report. We should be making a list of these good things to look at. We'd definitely be able to do that. We haven't gone into that level of detail yet, but that's certainly possible within the data that we have.
It's a question we've been asked a lot, actually. What does and doesn't constitute a mental health issue?
Yes, so this was as I sat there with a blank piece of paper writing the questionnaire, this was the first kind of thing to deal with. We talked a lot about kind of mental health symptoms, and we were expressing them in different sorts of ways. So we talked about there was physical, psychological, behavioural sort of symptoms. So, I mean, our response to that issue of trying to put a box around mental health problems was to actually try to cover a lot of the bases by asking in different ways, mentioning different types. We have questions around formal diagnosis, for example, which is another way of defining mental health problems. So we didn't want people as they're responding to only to be confronted with mental health issue and to only think of something like schizophrenia, for example, which can be the average person's response when you confront them with that as a term. So a little bit of definition around it, that it can include depression, anxiety, stress, behavioural issues, some physical symptoms. Expressing a lot of those within the definitions and allowing people to answer in a number of different ways was the best way of doing it.
This is a bit of a deep dive question. Informal barriers, younger, less confident talking. Could this be correlated to tenure, less experience than age?
Yes, I'm sure it is. Yeah. So, I mean, they've just had less experience in the workplace. Probably less experience talking, less experience with a number of colleagues. They've probably been through fewer jobs, fewer numbers of employers. So there's definitely something that builds with age over time. And you get that thing that when you look at, say, the different sizes of organisations, you tend to find that smaller organisations have an older age profile, and then that can, even though that they lack some of the extra support functions in smaller organisations, they can often benefit from the fact that people working there are just older and more experienced and have been through more issues both themselves and with other people that they manage. So there's definitely something there for younger people to be guided at a younger age. It's still affecting, when you look at the distribution of the mental health issues across age, it is flat. It's the same across a number of age groups. So they're having the same level of experiences there, but they just don't have the reservoir of experience themselves, both being a manager and being a worker.
Sarah, I can see you've got the mic.
Yes, I have. Is it on?
Yes, you're fine.
Sarah Page from the Trade Union Prospect. Something that we're very interested in is the impact of certain types of performance management system. And as a union that represents a lot of line manager, including first line managers, who are implementing a system that they may struggle with as well. And I just wondered whether you are able to explore whether the more aggressive performance management systems with quotas for results, whether you can see that and any impact, or is that too much detail?
Probably not in a formal sense of defining what sort of systems they're running, but there's plenty of comments about the pressure that managers feel themselves, and the pressure that's coming from above, and the targets and that sort of thing as well. And there were questions in there about, I think I mentioned one of them, where they're perhaps putting organisational targets above well-being and how many people are actually doing that. So not something we looked at in a kind of direct way, but probably as in a more sort of indirect way.
Okay. Got one more question. I'm not sure it's really for you. What kind of training do you think employers should provide to support managers and employers? Shall I answer that?
Yes.
Is if you look in our recommendations, which is you've got it in your pack, there's basically 3 calls to action and a whole load of recommendations that are aligned with the kind of key findings. So what we suggest is to actually provide basic mental health literacy for all employees and first aid mental health for all employers, particularly line managers. But in terms of our coalition of our 6 network partners, we have got several providers: Mind, Maudsley Learning at Work, Mental Health First Aid, Institute of Leadership and Management. So you can come and talk further, because there's a whole range of really good training out there.
It's related to that. Vanessa King from Action for Happiness. I was interested about the statistic that 80% of managers feel that what they do affects well-being. And did the survey dig down into them understanding that in more detail, really, and what it was about their style of management that impacted people's well-being?
There were some questions about sort of management styles that people had, and they were asked to agree or disagree that their management style was, such and such. But so I mean that could offer the potential to dig down into the data in that kind of way, and then you could correlate, the way that they feel about management and their personal style with some of the other questions about how well they think they managed episodes in the past, or how well or how comfortable they feel or confident they feel in recognising the symptoms. Whether there's any kind of difference between someone with a particular management style and as to whether, as you say, whether they think it's their responsibility to do anything.
I was thinking it more as a cause, actually,
Yeah.
rather than a how they treat it when somebody's presenting with issues, but a cause of issues.
Yes, it could be, because you could compare that with whether they took any action, for example, last time that anything happened, or whether I think it'd be too much of a leap to assign it to, well, okay, there's X number of line managers here have people that they manage who have had problems. We couldn't say that it was caused by them.